Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on which part of the world you are joining us from. Thank you very much for joining us in another ASB SEACEN online seminars or seminar series on macrofinance and emerging markets. We are very pleased to have ALP Simsek from MIT, who is currently on leave at Chicago booth with us today. But before coming to ALP and saying a few embarrassing things about him maybe later, but a few little advertising about the Asia School of Business, ASB, and the SEACEN Centre. I believe by now we all know the rules. Send us your questions online, and my friend Eli Remolona from the Asia School of Business and I will convey the questions to ALP. Here are the most recent seminars that we had by Matteo Maggiore, Elizabeth Kemp, who's now ALP's visitor, colleague, of course, and David Bakai from UCLA. And in the next 3 months, we'll be having Atul Lindley, Mushfiq Mubarak, and Shangjin Wei. The topics will have some kind of micro elements, but that will still be relevant for central banking. On the right-hand side, I listed a few upcoming seminars by the SEACEN Centre. My sincere apologies for this why hanging out there, really sorry about that one. But as you can see, we have a number of seminars on capital flows, debt, and also modeling coming from machine learning or DSG perspectives. The Asia School of Business, of course, is starting their brand new Master of Central Banking program in collaboration with MIT Sloan Management. That starts in June 2021, where our friend, colleague, Eli Remolona will be teaching along with some other wonderful faculty, both at ASB and MIT Sloan. They also have a number of other initiatives, including conversations with central bankers and other online seminars. The websites are below if you are interested in any of them. Finally, our speaker, this is the moment, I put ALP's handsome photo here. I guess ALP doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you by a small chance you didn't know him, ALP started his career, not a career, but his studies as an engineer and completed a Bachelor of Science and Masters in Science at MIT Electrical Engineering. And then he completed his PhD in Econ at MIT. And first, he was a faculty assistant professor at Harvard. Then he joined MIT as associate professor, and he's been there for a number of years, and currently on leave from MIT at Chicago booth for the next year or two, I believe. Today's topic is monetary policy with opinionated markets, and it has a lot of communications element in it, and it is something close to heart to many of us central bankers in the audience. Without further ado, and ALP, the floor or the screen is yours, and I will pass you the presenter right. Okay. We can see your slides, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So sorry about that. Okay. Can now you can hear me and see my screen, right?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks again. And this is it's wonderful to join you, albeit virtually. and this is a joint work with Ricardo Caballero, and it is motivated by the observation that central banks and financial markets often disagree about the path of interest rates. So in this figure, we're showing these disagreements for the US. So the dots in this figure show the Fed's for select FOMC meetings, the Fed's belief for future interest rates. So on the right panel, we have the median of the so-called the dot curve that reflects the median projection by the FOMC member. And on the left panel, we have the assumptions that go into the green book. So these reflect the Fed staff's predictions, again, the dots. And the solid lines show for the matched meetings, the market's predictions as revealed in futures prices. And as you see, the two predictions rarely line up, and sometimes there are big gaps. And these, you may want to do some adjustment to this figure, of course. So among other things, you may want to cleanse the sort of the market's predictions, the forward curve, from risk premium effects. But people who have done that at the Fed with careful methods find that these gaps still remain. At these horizons, risk premium is not big enough to close these gaps. Or you can measure the market's beliefs from surveys. Again, similar gaps remain. This is not even a US specific phenomenon. In other countries where the central banks release their, publish their forecasts, similar gaps are observed. And these gaps are a bit of a problem for central bankers because they suggest the market might be perceiving central banks' actions as mistakes. And they're a little hard to understand also from the perspective of existing theory, because the existing models are very much focused on asymmetric information. The idea is that the Fed has superior might have, or central banks have superior information about their policy strategy, or perhaps also the state of the economy, and the issue is how to credibly signal that information to the public. While that's very important consideration in this context, we don't think it's a good starting point to understand these figures, because, for instance, if you focus on the right panel here, these are the market's predictions at the end of the FOMC meeting. So after the dots are released to the public, after the FOMC members say, this is the interest rate path that we plan to set, even after seeing that the market expects something different, that suggests, to the extent that there's some signaling, it's not perfect. Instead, we think this points to opinionated, genuine disagreement between the market and the Fed about what's going to happen. And later, I'm going to show you some anecdotal evidence, survey evidence for this type of disagreement, but there's also a lot of anecdotal evidence that supports this type of opinionated disagreement. The markets, from just observation, tend to be very opinionated. Actually, right now is an example of this, where in the US, the market seems to think the fiscal package will translate into bigger inflationary pressures and lead to faster interest rate hikes than what the, it's like this type of situation, and what the Fed thinks. The Fed seems less concerned with inflation. But we can also give other examples. So an example that I like comes from December 2007. So it's this meeting here. And that in that meeting, the Fed actually cut the interest rates by 25 basis points. That was the run-up to the global financial crisis. But the market was expecting a bigger cut. So if you read the newspaper commentary around that event, you see the markets were quite disappointed with the Fed's decision, because they thought the financial conditions would deteriorate further and weigh down the economy, and they thought the Fed didn't understand the scope of the problem. For instance, Wall Street Journal quotes David Greenwell from Morgan Stanley as saying, "There's no question the Fed has fallen way behind the curve. There's a growing sense the Fed doesn't get it." So that doesn't feel very differential to the Fed. And in that particular episode, the markets turned out to be right. But the point is not that the markets are usually right, but that they are usually very opinionated. Okay, so motivated by these observations, we build a model with the key feature that the Fed and the financial markets have this type of opinionated disagreements about economic activity. In particular, we're going to make them disagree about aggregate demand. So in the model, there's going to be a process that drives spending in the economy, and because of nominal rigidity is also output, without changing potential output. So you can think, if you want something concrete, think like consumer sentiment, but it could be something broader than that. And agents will disagree about the evolution of that. And it will be an agree to disagree type dogmatic disagreement. So they will know, I will know what you think, but I will stick to my own view, because I don't think you have any information that I haven't already incorporated. But it doesn't mean we are crazy. We both learn from data. It's just that I don't learn directly I don't learn from you. I think I've already incorporated all the information I need. Okay, so I hear a little bit of an echo. Do you guys hear that too, or is it okay?
Yes, we hear the same. I'm wondering if anyone has got the mic on, and if they can switch them off, please.
Oh, okay. So they both so it's that they're opinionated in that they don't think the other guy has information, but they learn from data. It's just they don't learn from each other. Okay, so and we find that these features explain the interest rate disagreements that I showed you. So interest rates are endogenous objects. We explain the disagreements about interest rates from disagreements about more fundamental or fundamental state of the economy, basically. But we show that these disagreements go beyond explaining the picture I showed you. It turns out that disagreements are also central for understanding optimal interest rate policy. In particular, the Fed, central banks cannot ignore the market's view, even though they think the market is wrong and they're right. They need to pay attention to what the market thinks. The reason is that the markets in this environment, as I've already alluded to, perceive the central bank as making mistakes, setting incorrect interest rates. And this turns out that this weighs down economic activity, or it affects economic activity. It becomes a shifter of economic activity. So the central bank needs to pay attention to the market, not because it cares about the market's view, but because it is important to hit its objective of stabilizing economic activity. But it doesn't mean the central bank surrenders to the market either. Instead, the policy that the central bank follows is what we call expected gradualism. The central bank initially accommodates the market somewhat, partially, but it also expects to implement its view more fully in the future, as it expects the market to learn from data and to come closer to its view. So it expects to sort of implement its view more forcefully in the future. It's only implemented partially now. Third, we find that these disagreements also provide a micro foundation for monetary policy shocks. So many of you will know that in the textbook New Keynesian model, these shocks are fluctuations around an interest rate rule, right? That's how they are modeled. So it's like the Fed wakes up and decides to set a high interest rate or low interest rate. So that's not a very appealing theory of monetary policy shocks. Instead, in our model, they're going to be micro-founded, and we're going to envision monetary policy shocks as times at which the Fed will develop a view about the economy, and that view either become more bullish or more bearish, and that view will get communicated to the public either via its decisions or via its communication with the public. Okay, so, and it turns out that for the most part, in a model where the market doesn't agree with the Fed's view, these revelations of the Fed's view will act like monetary policy shocks. But there are some subtleties and important differences from the textbook shocks. And in particular, I'm going to show you 3 versions of these shocks. And one of these, what we call the tantrum shocks, is potentially the most damaging. It obtains when the market misinterprets the Fed's view, and as it becomes a big shock to economic activity. And these shocks will motivate even further gradualism than in our baseline model. The central banks will be even more cautious to try to mitigate these tantrums. And they will also motivate communication policies of the types that we have seen central banks adopt in recent decades. The reason for communication will be to communicate your view more fully to the market so they don't misinterpret you, right? You're not trying to convince the market, but you're at least trying to communicate your view so they know exactly what you think, that there's no possibility of tantrum shocks and misinterpretation. Finally, for the most part, these results will apply regardless of how flat the Phillips curve is and how sticky the prices are. But we can allow for some, and I'm going to, for simplicity, focus on full price stickiness. But when we allow for some price flexibility, make the Phillips curve a little less flat, actually everything still applies, and we get additional interesting results. We find that in this environment, disagreements also affect inflation expectations. So when the market thinks the Fed does a poor job of monetary policy, it also starts to expect inflation or disinflation, and that ends up affecting the Fed's trade-off similar to a cost push shock, even though the model doesn't have a cost push shock. In particular, the divine coincidence breaks down, and the Fed faces a trade-off between stabilizing output and inflation. So in the interest of time, I'm going to mostly focus on the first three results, but you can see the fourth one that's in the paper. Okay, so, and I'm going to get to the results in a minute, and this is a theory paper, but we do have an empirical section. So let me tell you what we do in that section before I get to the model. This is the role of this is to motivate the modeling ingredients. So the basic premise of our model is to show that to explain the interest rate disagreements from aggregate demand disagreements. And we looked for this type of correlation in the survey data. We looked at blue chip financial forecasts, and we do see in blue chip forecasts, at the individual forecast, this type of correlation. Institutions that predict higher aggregate demand as proxied by inflation also tend to predict higher interest rates. That supports sort of the main premise of our model. But more interestingly, in the survey data, we also see evidence of confident opinionated disagreement. So when an institution develops a view of aggregate demand, let's say it becomes more pessimistic about inflation relative to the average, that view basically remains for a few years. There is some flipping. At some point, they might become more optimistic, but for several years, they stay with that relative view. And that supports this opinionated disagreement, and that pushes back against some stories of like dispersed information, because there is no question. This is a monthly release, blue chip, and there's no question that after a month or so, they see each other's forecasts. So everyone sees what everyone else says, and the consensus says, but they stick to their own view. That's consistent with what we're going to put into the model. By the way, we also look at within the FOMC disagreement. So you can look at the individual predictions in the summary of economic projections, individual dots. And if you look within FOMC prediction disagreements, they also have basically the same features that I show you here. When a member predicts less inflation than average, it basically keeps predicting less inflation than average. So it's quite persistent and confident disagreements also among the FOMC. So in the model is going to be about disagreements between the market and between the Fed, the central banks. The evidence that we present is within the market and within the FOMC, but the assumption is that if you see it within both groups, it will also apply across groups. Okay, so with that, let me get to the core of the paper, the theory. So I'm gonna let me start with present the model and then apply to the optimal interest rate policy, and finally I'm going to talk about how we think of monetary policy shocks in this environment. And the model is, for the most part, relatively standard, close to the textbook New Keynesian model that you can find in, let's say, Gali's textbook. So there's except for this belief assumption, which I'm going to describe in a minute. So there's a representative agent, that's what we call the market, and it has relatively standard preferences. And on the supply side, there are these firms, again, with relatively standard technologies. The key thing about the supply side is prices are nominal rigidities, right? Prices are somewhat sticky. And for the purpose of presentation, I'm going to assume they're fully sticky, just to keep things simple. But in the paper, actually, we relax that. But when prices are fully sticky, basically what this does is it makes demand the forcing variable, right? Output is determined by demand here, spending, and firms are happy to respond to that. And the spending or demand will move around, so there's going to be aggregate demand shocks. And the way we model aggregate demand shocks is that at every period, so when we come to the period, we know the productivity of that potential output of the economy at that period. So there are no supply shocks in that sense. But we learn at every period GT. Okay, we learn about the potential in the next period. So when we learn that G is high, the future looks bright, the future looks good. So, and people spend more, and because the Keynesian model, output goes up, and the G is low, the future looks bleak, people spend less, and output is low, right? So we put basically these new shocks in the model, but really the functional role of G is to shift aggregate demand. We could have done different things here. That's why we call this aggregate demand shock. It's a stand-in for a variety of things that shift aggregate demand. And in particular, if you derive the IS curve here, so Y tilde is the output relative to the frictionless benchmark. It's the output gap. You see, it has the IS curve as a usual formula. G becomes a demand shifter, as I already mentioned, and high interest rates, all else equal, lower demand and output gap. And also expected gaps in the future, all else equal, higher economic activity in the future increases activity now, because expectations are forward-looking, right? So this slide is actually completely standard. Here is where we depart from the textbook model. We make the Fed, central banks, move before observing the aggregate demand shock for the period, right? So we divide every period into two phases. In the first phase, the central bank moves and sets the interest rate. Then the aggregate demand shock is realized, and then output and output gap and a market moves and output gap is determined, right? So if the central bank moves after observing the shock, actually we have the textbook model. So this timing assumption gives all of the results in the paper. But we think this timing assumption moves the model in a more realistic direction, right? Because it makes monetary policy realistically hard. Right? In the real world, when you think about doing monetary policy, unlike in the textbook, when you set interest rate in real time, you don't observe economic activity, right? Like in real time, you don't observe output, you don't observe inflation. You need to make assumptions about those things, let alone the gaps. The gaps require even more assumptions about what the potential is. But even just observing activity is challenging in real time. So this is one way of thinking about that. But another way of thinking about that is transmission lag. So again, in the real world, when central banks set interest rates, it starts affecting the economy after some time. It has its biggest impact after a while for a variety of reasons. There are these transmission lags. And again, when you set policy, you need to look ahead and think about how the conditions will be by the time your decision starts to kick into the economy, right? So for a variety of reasons, this assumption we think is relevant. And what it does is it makes the central banks believe a relevant policy parameter, right? So by assumption here, central bank cannot stabilize gaps state by state, but it does the second best thing. If you solve a standard gap minimizing problem, for the most part, you find that central bank stabilizes the gaps on average under its own belief. So the Fed's belief becomes a policy parameter, and we make the market have a different belief about this aggregate demand G than the Fed. So that's creates the core tension of the model, because the market thinks the Fed makes a monetary policy mistake, right? The market thinks the Fed should be following this rule with an M superscript. So the market thinks the Fed sets an incorrect interest rate and induces either on average negative gaps or positive gaps, and the model will help us resolve this tension. So we put these mistakes in quotes because these are not mistakes under the objective belief or under the Fed's belief. These are really mistakes as perceived by the market. But nonetheless, they matter to the policy decision. The reason is, again, if you go back to the IS curve, you see the market's expectations for future activity show up here. So when the market expects poor monetary policy to generate negative gaps or positive gaps, you see through the IS curve, it will shift economic activity immediately, and the Fed will need to pay attention to that because it's trying to stabilize the activity, right? So in particular, if you apply the Fed's policy rule to this equation, set the expectation of this to zero under the Fed's view, you can solve for the interest rate that the Fed needs to set to hit its target. And you see, it depends on the Fed's expectations for aggregate demand. That's intuitive, but it also depends on the market's perception of these mistakes, right? Again, for the reason that these mistakes shift economic activity, and the Fed indirectly pays attention to that. And output gap itself is easy to understand. You just take this and plug it into the first equation, and you can see state by state what happens to the output gap. By design, it is stabilized around the Fed's view on average, but shocks relative to the Fed's view move the output gap because of this timing assumption. Okay, so, and these equations apply quite generally, but to solve them further and to understand how exactly the market's belief affects the decision, you need to specify a process for aggregate demand and the beliefs about aggregate demand. And I'm going to show you in a minute a process, but let me emphasize that actually you can solve this under much more general processes. These equations are general, right? But we've started with something relatively simple, so we focused on this particular process for aggregate demand. So imagine aggregate demand as coming in two components. There is a transitory component. In every period, there is some noise-like, mean zero noise-like term that moves aggregate demand, and there is a more persistent component, and we made it fully persistent, but we can also make it AR1. The important thing is that it's somewhat persistent, persists across periods, and this is what we're going to make the agents disagree about. Okay, so in particular here, we're going to treat this as an unknown parameter, and agents will start with initial beliefs about this parameter. So G0M is the market's view on this persistent component, initial view on persistent component, and G0F is the Fed's central bank's initial view of this persistent component. Okay, so if you want a concrete example, think of like shocks hitting the economy, like new things happening, like the financial crisis, trade wars, Trump, COVID, and history doesn't offer a lot of guidance for how to think of these things, so it's natural for people to form initially different views. And G0F is what the Fed thinks how the Fed thinks this event will affect the economy, and G0M is how the market thinks. But they do learn over time, right? Because as they see economic activity over time, they'll observe by observing output GT, and they will become an imperfect signal of the persistent component. So imagine like macroeconomic data releases that you observe regularly will tell you the strength of the economy, and you learn over time about G. But it's just that initially we have different views, and we learn somewhat slowly because we are somewhat confident in our views, right? The C0 parameter, it captures actually the we call confidence, is the precision of our initial priors, and that will govern the speed of learning. Okay, so in particular, after every history, people will have some conditional belief about aggregate demand. We call that GTJ, and we're going to assume agents start with different beliefs, but then they follow Bayesian updating. So that GTG follows under Bayesian updating intuitive rule. It's basically at every period, your view in that period is a weighted average of your view in the last period and the most recent data realization. And this little c is what we call relative confidence. It's just a number between 0 and 1. It's closer to 1 when confidence is high, right? So when confidence is high, people cling on to their priors longer. When confidence is low, they put more weight on data. So this picture shows an example where the Fed is initially more optimistic. So the purple line is the Fed's belief, central bank's belief. So and the blue line is the market's belief. The Fed is more optimistic initially, and black line is the most recent data realization. So they both move in the direction of the data, but when they are initially highly confident, so this is the solid lines here, you see disagreements remain quite some time as in the survey data. If they were less confident, they would move much more quickly in the direction of the data, and disagreements would disappear much more quickly. We want to be in the case with relatively high confidence, which also seems to be consistent with the data I showed you earlier. Okay, so, but I'm going to also show you what happens when you lower confidence. Here is another implication of Bayesian updating that that is important for the results. So it turns out that agents not only learn over time, but they also, in this environment, expect the other agent to learn and to come toward their view. And how do you see that? Let's say you're the Fed and I'm the market. And let's think about, fix a particular period, period 0, and let's think about what each agent, what you and I think about each other's views in a future period, right? So the purple line here is what you think currently about what you're going to think in 10 periods from now. It's a flat line because you don't think you'll change your mind, right? So what you think you're going to think in 10 periods is on average what you think now. It's like the law of iterated expectations. Okay, so, but if you look at the dotted lines here, that's like what you think I will think 10 periods from now. That's much closer to your view. Why? Because you think you're right, and you think the data realizations in between here will validate your view, and you know that I put some weight on the data, so you expect me to come to start to see the world like you do after a while. Okay, so, and I expect, of course, the exact opposite. I think I'm right, and I think you'll start, and the data will validate me, and I think you'll start to see the world like I do. And this will be important for understanding the fanning out of the interest rate predictions that I showed you in the beginning. Okay, so, and this applies quite naturally under Bayesian updating, but we think it's like actually a more general feature if you sort of have like a behavioral worldview where people are not fully Bayesian. This would still apply as long as you know, basically the key thing you need is that you think you're right, and you think, you know that I put some weight on the data. It doesn't need to be fully Bayesian. Okay, so, all right, and I'm now ready to show you the results. And the idea is basically to insert these belief processes into the equations that I showed you. But let me first show you what happens when there's no disagreement. When agents have the same belief initially, then we have something completely standard. At every period, the interest rate the Fed sets depends on the conditional expectation of aggregate demand, which is the same across the agents. And output gaps are stabilized on average, but they do move because of shocks and the timing assumption. Okay, so, and if you look at in this benchmark, the forward and the dot curves, the market's expectations for future interest rates and the Fed's expectations for future interest rates at a particular period, let's say period 0, you see it also is standard. They lie on top of one another, and they reflect the current views of aggregate demand, right? So when the aggregate demand expectations are low, economy is expected to be weak, the interest rate expectations are going to be low, otherwise they're going to be high, right? So, okay, so this is a benchmark. Let me next show you how the policy and the equilibrium changes with disagreements. So this is one of the main results of the paper. So if you look at the output gap formula, that looks similar to what I showed you. Still, by design, output gaps are stabilized around the Fed's view, and they move because of shocks. But the disagreements manifest themselves in the interest rate the Fed needs to set to achieve that outcome. Now, you might think a naive prediction would be the Fed sets rho plus GF, right? Essentially, its view of aggregate demand. That's not what the Fed does here. Instead, maybe it starts with that, but then it moves somewhat to the market's view, and it ends up setting a weighted average of the Fed's view and the market's view, right? So, so you can also rewrite this as it's a weighted average of the Fed's ideal interest rate and the market's ideal interest rate. It sort of moves somewhat to the market's views. And how much you move depends on this relative confidence parameter. When confidence is high, this is closer to 1, so then actually you move a lot more. So you discount your view quite a bit and move a lot more to the market's view, right? And the second part of the result characterizes the forward and the dot curves. And unlike in the benchmark, they don't lie on top of one another anymore. There's a fanning out, like in the first picture I showed you. And how much there's fanning out reflects the current disagreements of aggregate demand. GF minus GM determines that extent of fanning out. Okay, so let me show you this result on a picture, and I'm going to also use this picture to provide intuition. So this picture shows the dot curve and the forward curve at period 0. So the Fed's expectations of interest rate and the market's expectations for interest rate under different specifications of beliefs. Let's focus on the left panel. That's the case with when confidence is relatively high. So if you look at the lower dash line here, that's like an initial state of affairs when there is no disagreement, and both the market and the Fed thinks interest rate should be 6%, so the two curves lie on top of one another at 6%. Okay, so the upper dash line here shows you what would happen if both the market and the Fed become more optimistic about demand, economic activity by 1 percentage point. So then they both think interest rate should be higher by 1 percentage point, that the curves would stay on top of one another and lift up by 1 percentage point, right? So the solid lines here show you what happens when the Fed becomes optimistic by 1 percentage point, but the market remains with the more pessimistic view. And as you see, now the dot and the forward curve don't lie on top of one another. They both lift up, but they lift up by different amounts. And the dot curve, as you look into future and future horizons, tends to approximate the Fed's ideal rate. And the forward curve, if you look into the future horizons, tends to approximate the market's ideal rate, but they differ. And also the current policy rate the Fed sets, the Fed doesn't set 7%, which is its ideal rate. Instead, it's set somewhere in between. It partially accommodates the market. But there's also expected gradualism in the sense that the Fed expects to set its ideal rate going into the future, right? That's what we call expected gradualism. Okay, so what is the intuition for the result? So why does the Fed not hike the rates by 1 percentage point here? Well, the reason is that in this example, actually the market view didn't change at all, right? So the market doesn't think interest rates should change at all, but the Fed still raises the interest rates. The Fed moves somewhat to the market, but doesn't fully, because it has become more bullish about economic activity. It raises interest rates somewhat. And these interest rate hikes are basically mistakes from the market's perspective, right? But here's the subtle thing. Not only the current rates go up, all the forward rates go up as well, because disagreements don't die down right away. Even with Bayesian learning, as I showed you, disagreements remain over time. So if there is some disagreement that hikes the rate now, that the market expects interest rate to remain high also in the future periods somewhat, right? So that all of those future interest rate hikes, according to the market's view, are basically mistakes as well. And because activity is forward-looking, these mistakes weigh down on economic activity immediately, right? So you can see it from the IS curve. The market expects too high rates in the future, weak activity in the future, that weighs down economic activity. Or you can think more directly, right? As the long-term interest, as the yield curve shifts up, that will raise long-term interest rate, and it will already become a monetary tightening. There's already, if you want, built-in monetary tightening in this environment. So the Fed doesn't need to do very much to stabilize the economy, right? So essentially, one way of thinking about what the Fed is trying to do here is trying to engineer a lift up of the forward curve, which cumulatively will amount to 1 percentage point, which is just enough to counter its bullish view of economic activity, right? So and then how much you need to hike depends on this area, how much the forward rates lift up. And it turns out that how much the forward rates lift up depend on this confidence parameter, because that captures the extent to which the current disagreements will persist into the future, right? When confidence is high, essentially current views will persist into the future, and this area is going to become very high, and then you don't need to do very much, right? The forward curve already lifts up a lot, so you just need to raise the interest rate a little bit. And in contrast, if you look at the right panel, that's the case when the confidence is relatively low. The disagreements die down more quickly, so the forward curve doesn't lift up as much. In that case, the Fed needs to raise interest rates a lot more to hit its target. Okay, so now why does the dot curve and the forward curve fan out like this? Essentially, in this model, everyone agrees with the monetary policy framework. What is the monetary policy framework? It is this: the Fed sets a weighted average of the two views, but they disagree on the inputs into that framework, right? So they know that future interest rates will be set according to that weighted average framework, but they disagree on how the views will be in the future, right? The Fed thinks it's right, and for the reason I showed, it expects the market to move close to its view. So under its framework, it sort of expects to set rates that are closer to its view, right? So it's going to be less. The Fed thinks the market is now think I'm wrong, but they'll come to see the world like I do, so I won't have to accommodate them as much in the future. And the market thinks exactly the opposite, right? The market thinks the Fed is confused, setting too high rates, but they will see the data, they will realize that we are right, and they will start accommodating us even more, and they'll start setting rates even closer to our view, right? So it comes quite naturally from disagreements, actually, and some learning generates this fanning out of the interest rates that we see in the data. Okay, let me next switch gears and tell you how we use this model to think about monetary policy shocks. So far, I've assumed everyone knows everyone else. We both know each other's beliefs, right? So it's an agree to disagree situation. I see your belief, I think you're wrong, and you see my belief as well. In practice, it might be a little difficult to observe each other's views. I think there are ways for the Fed to observe the central banks to observe the market's belief from asset prices. Like you can look at the forward curve, you can look at the yield curve, other asset prices. You know, with some noise, they will reveal what the market thinks. But the other way around is not immediate, right? There's no automatic mechanism that reveals the central bank's views to the public. And in fact, a lot of central bank communication is about telling the public about how the central bank views the economy. So it turns out that if you explicitly model that, the revelation of the central bank's view to the public acts very similar to textbook shocks, but with some subtlety. So let me show you how we do that. So suppose we have the same exact model, but with one difference. In the beginning of the model, the market doesn't know the central bank's views, GF, but it thinks it's drawn from some distribution, G bar F. And the Fed knows you know my belief. Let's say if I'm the market, I don't know your belief. You're the Fed, you know my belief. Okay, you still know, the Fed still knows the market's belief. It's just that I'm a little unsure about what you think. And otherwise, the model is exactly the same as before. And it turns out that there's an equilibrium that's also exactly the same as before. So this is the interest rate rule that I showed you before. It turns out that if the Fed sets exactly the same rate here, it's still an equilibrium. And if you look at that rule, you see there's a one-to-one mapping between the Fed's view and the interest rate. When the Fed is more bullish, it sets a higher rate. When the Fed is less bullish, more bearish, it sets a lower rate. So, right. So when the market sees that interest rate, when I see this interest rate, I learn basically your view. I learned exactly. Initially, I'm a little uncertain, but I see your interest rate decision, and I learn exactly your view, GF. And once I learn your view, we are back into the earlier model, and the whole equilibrium is exactly the same. Okay. But at the time at which your view gets revealed to me, so your policy decisions, let's think about this policy announcement. Right before the announcement, I expect this to apply with G bar F on average. At the announcement, I learn exactly GF. So there's actually an interest rate when you're like more bullish than what I expect it to be. There's going to be an interest rate change. The policy rate will go up, but also the whole forward curve will go up, right? Now I learned you're more bullish. My expectations for future rates will go up as well. The whole forward curve will lift up. And because I consider these things to be mistakes, I don't share your view. I learn your view, but I don't share it. So actually my expectations for activity, market's expectations for activity will go down, right? So this looks very much like a textbook monetary policy shock if you think about it. So the Fed says something to the public, and the market starts expecting high interest rates and low economic activity. So very much like textbook shocks, but it is micro-founded in the sense that it's not like random. What happens is that the Fed develops a view of the economy, and that view gets revealed to the public. A positive interest rate shock is like when the Fed is more bullish about the economy than what we thought. And this is an answer to, this is important to have some sort of micro foundation for these shocks, because there's a huge literature trying to estimate the impact of these shocks on economic activity, but without a structural interpretation, you're never quite sure if there's a confounding factor or not. So Valerie Ramey, in her handbook chapter, reviews that literature and argues that, we don't have many good theories of what a structural monetary policy shock should be. We think our model provides one structural shock. It's not the only way to microfound monetary policy. You can also think about the market learning, the Fed putting more weight on inflation versus activity, right? There are other things you could do here, but we think this is a reasonable microfoundation. The market learns how bullish the Fed is. And for the most part, like in terms of, for instance, immediate asset price reaction, if you put stock prices, that would also go down here at the time of the announcement because they depend on the market's expectation. So for the most part, this is like textbook shock, but there is a subtlety when you start interpreting the empirical regressions that people run, because for that, we need to take a stand on who is right? So far, in every result that I showed you, actually it doesn't matter who's right. Ultimately, the equilibrium depends on beliefs and belief disagreements. But when we think about interpreting the empirical regressions, you need to take a view on who is right, because what's going to get revealed in the data on average is the objective belief, right? Or the data generating process. So whoever closer to the objective belief is going to matter. So the result that we have here is that if you think about like a interest rate hike driven by a Fed belief shock, its subsequent impact on activity in the data, like this is what the regressions will pick up, is going to be negative if the market is right. If the market is right on average, basically then in fact the Fed, well, this was in fact an objective mistake to hike the interest rate, and in fact it will lower economic activity, output gaps will decline, inflation will decline, right? But if the Fed is right, not so, right? If the Fed is right, in fact, regressions will recover a zero coefficient, because the Fed is by design setting rates to hit its target, and if it achieves its target, it's right, you're going to basically find zero effects on output gap and inflation, right? So whether or not you find the right coefficients depend on whether the market or the Fed is right. Now, in a disagreement context, it's actually natural to think reality might be somewhere in between the two views. And by the way, there's a literature doing forecasting horse races between the Fed, central banks, and financial markets, and there doesn't seem to be a clear winner. So the idea that reality is somewhere in between is actually reasonable. In that case, you're going to find the negative coefficient on average, but the more the Fed is right, the less smaller and the less significant the coefficients will be. And let me also say that the model makes actually contingent predictions, right? If you're able to cut the data based on episodes in which the Fed is right versus the market is right, the model makes contingent predictions. When the market is right, you should see more negative coefficients. When the Fed is right, closer to zero. Okay, so there is some empirical potential here to explore. But so far, I made the Fed's job a little easy in that the interest rate decision fully reveals the Fed's belief to the public, right? So, but if you think in practice, the beliefs are very complex objects, and the Fed might disagree, the Fed and the market might disagree about lots of things about economic activity, and the interest rate decision might not fully reveal this belief, Fed's view to the public. And so that gets us to the second shocks that we uncovered. We call them the market reaction shocks because they depend on how the market interprets and reacts to the Fed's interest rate decision. Okay, so and to capture that, we make now the Fed and the market disagree about two dimensions of aggregate demand. So so far this V was just a mean zero noise, right? Every period aggregate demand is shocked by mean zero noise. Now I make the Fed have a view about that. The Fed has also a view about aggregate demand in the next quarter or the next year, in addition to the view on the long-term demand that I showed you earlier, right? So, and for simplicity, the market still thinks it's mean zero, but the Fed thinks its mean is VF, okay? And if the market knew the Fed's view, so we are in the agree to disagree benchmark that I showed you earlier, if you redo the analysis, you'd find this is the interest rate the Fed would want to set. It would accommodate its disagreements with the market in terms of the long-term view, but it shouldn't accommodate this short-term disagreement. right? Because by design, this is not going to persist into the future. The forward curve is not going to react to that. So you really need to hike the interest rate 1-to-1 if you form a view that economic activity will be strong this quarter or this year. You really need to, and you know the market knows that it's a short-term thing. You really need to know your interest rate decision 1-to-1 to push back against that activity. Okay, so but here's the more subtle part, right? So we want to make now the market uncertain about both dimensions of now you have this view, so you can have a long-term view or short-term view. I don't know, I think either dimension is drawn from some distribution. I'm not sure about either dimension. Okay, so what happens in this case when you set an interest rate, I don't fully learn your views because I get a one-dimensional signal and there's a two-dimensional belief that you have. Instead, the intuitive thing happens when I see an interest rate hike relative to what I expected. I see that you're more bullish. I get an optimism signal, but I get a bundled optimism signal. I cannot quite figure out whether you're optimistic about the long term or the short term. And I interpret that according to my prior uncertainty, right? So this tau here, which reflects my uncertainty about long term versus the short term, your long term versus short term view, it's just a number between 0 and 1. When it's closer to 1, I'm going to attribute your optimism signal to long term views. And when it's closer to 0, I'm going to attribute it to short term views. Okay, so and the result that we have here is that this tau, or the market's reaction to the Fed's decision, derives everything. It derives the forward curve. That's intuitive, right? The forward curve will lift up or down according to how the market interprets your hike, but it also derives the optimal policy decision. So in particular, the Fed's optimal policy rate here depends on tau, but it doesn't depend on whether the Fed is actually long-term or short-term optimistic, right? So to give a concrete example, suppose the Fed has a short-term view, like thinks the aggregate demand the next year will be a high, but then it's not going to persist into the future. Still, if the market knew that you have a short-term view, you would hike the interest rate 1-to-1. You would hike it quite a bit here. But when the market doesn't know and the market is reactive, tau is close to 1, you act as if you have short-term, long-term optimism. You hike the interest rate very cautiously, like in the examples that I showed you. The reason is that because the market will read your decision as long-term and the whole forward curve will lift up, there's going to be built-in monetary tightening. So you don't need to hike the rates very much. Essentially, it's back to the same thing I told you earlier. You're trying to engineer a lift up of the forward curve, which cumulatively will add up to a 1 percentage point tightening. So when the market reads you as long-term optimist and the forward curve reacts, you want to raise a little bit. Okay, so you kind of disregard your own view. You go with how the market reads your view. You think about how the forward curve will react to your decision. And this gets to us third shocks, the tantrum shocks, because if you think about this tau, how the market will react to the Fed's decision, it's a difficult thing to figure out in practice, right? Especially if tau is changing over time. It's like a counterfactual. You're trying to figure out if I change the rates, how the forward curve will react to that. And that gets to the possibility of the central banks getting that tau wrong or maybe being uncertain about tau. And that gets to the third group of shocks that we have, tantrum shocks. And let me start with the more extreme case where the central bank gets this tau wrong. But we don't need such an extreme thing. I'm going to also show you the case when central bank is uncertain about the tau. But let's start with this case. Imagine, again, central bank has short-term view about activity this quarter or this year, and it thinks the market is not very reactive, and it thinks the market will read its decision as short-term. So it goes ahead and hikes the rates 1-to-1 with its view of the economy by 1 percentage point. But unbeknownst to the central bank, the market turns out to be reactive. So what happens? Well, first, the market looks at this decision and says, well, the central bank must have gone crazy, because with a reactive market, usually the central bank moves the interest rate a little bit. So when you see a big reaction, like big hike like this, you think the central bank must have become really optimistic about economic activity. And not only that, I think that, and I think that I also attribute it to long-term optimism. So the whole forward curve lifts up quite a bit, right? So essentially, the market blows this decision out of proportion and lifts up the whole forward curve. And all of this shaded area are interest rate hikes that are not intended by the Fed, right? So all of these are also perceived mistakes. But in the earlier models, the Fed shocked the market optimally, right? You created perceived mistakes, but in an optimal amount to hit your target. Now here, basically the forward curve reacts more than the Fed intended it to react. And because of that, the Fed misses its target even under its own view, right? So the purple line in the earlier graphs were flat at 0. The Fed always sits under appropriate policy, it is target to 0 by setting the rates appropriately. Here, because you got the tau market's reaction wrong, actually you missed your target even under your own belief, and you missed it even more under my belief. Okay, so, but of course, as you know, in the next period, when you get this adjust the rate, you're going to correct, and then because now you know that I'm reactive, you're going to readjust policy. So it says short-term miss, but you're going to miss it nonetheless. And this is extreme. These assumptions that Fed is wrong about tau is extreme, but we think it captures elements of what happens in episodes where the market reacts to the Fed's decision in a way that surprises the Fed or the central banks, right? So one example is the taper tantrum of 2013. That's why we call this a tantrum shock. If you recall, that was the time of the QE, and so it's a little different than our model, but similar forces applied. And Ben Bernanke was the chairman of the Fed at the time, gave a speech to the Congress where he said that they might start adjusting asset purchases, and the market seems to have blown it out of proportion, right? And the whole long-term interest rates shift lifted up quite a bit, especially for riskier securities like emerging markets, and that episode came to be known as the taper tantrum. And the Fed actually, the Ben Bernanke after that episode actually had to go around and make a lot of speeches to the market and telling them that you guys like misread us. We are not going to unconditionally adjust our asset purchases. We're going to look at the data, and you know. So essentially, it does have the flavor of there was a one-time monetary tightening, and the market interpreted as a much more long-term tightening. You know, even though that's not what the Fed intended. So the model, you know, has elements of that, although we don't have QE per se. Okay, so but we don't need such an extreme assumption to make the tantrums interesting. So it turns out that the market's reaction matters under less extreme assumptions. So this is the more typical situation where the central bank is uncertain about the market's reaction. So imagine actually the market is either reactive or unreactive, and the Fed doesn't quite know that, and it puts probability of delta to a reactive market. And the market knows delta, so no one is confused about anything, right? It's just uncertainty about how the market will react to the Fed's decisions. So the result that we have here is that, well, it's intuitive thing happens. The Fed, because you don't know the market's reaction, you set your rate according to a weighted average between the cases where the market is reactive versus unreactive. But the interesting thing is that you overweight the case where the market is reactive relative to its probability of happening, right? So you put here not delta, but a bigger probability to the tantrum scenario. And relatedly, unlike every other result I showed you, the policy rule here actually, even from an ex ante point of view, doesn't set output gaps to 0. For instance, like when you become more optimistic, you hike interest rates more cautiously, and therefore you leave some gap on average, even from an ex ante point of view. Now, why are you doing that? Essentially, you're trying to minimize the quadratic gap, and it turns out that in this scenario, you're sacrificing some mean to reduce the variance of the output gap. And you're overweighting this tantrum scenario because you fear that scenario, because essentially your decision will have a much bigger impact on economic activity and output gap in that scenario than in the usual case, where in the usual case you're going to have a 1-to-1 impact. If the market turns out to be of the tantrum type, you're going to have a 1-to-3 impact or maybe more. So you end up overweighting that case and sacrificing some mean, so you move more cautious. This goes back to an old idea by William Brainard, where you're uncertain about how your policy will affect the economy. You're uncertain about the marginal impact of your policy in the economy. It typically pushes the policymaker toward a more gradualist policy stand. And we have an example of that here. And the thing that makes you uncertain is that the market can be of this tantrum type, and the forward curve might overreact relative to what you intend. Okay, so, but even when you take this more cautious stance here, you do worse in terms of your objective, right? Because tau is a policy parameter, you don't know that, so you end up getting a worse. You do worse in terms of hitting your output gap objective compared to a scenario where you know the tau. So that gets to our final set of results about Fed communication. So you can try to avoid the tantrum, mitigate the tantrum shocks here by making the Fed and the public talk to one another. Okay, so and the first option is that Fed, you can try to figure out my reaction time. You can try to figure out my tau, the market's tau, and that actually we see some efforts in that direction, right? The New York Fed is doing this survey of dealers where some of the questions have the flavor of if you were to hike the rates, how would your view of the future rates change? And it looks like they're trying to figure out the how. But it's a difficult thing because it's ultimately a counterfactual. You're trying to figure out how the market, and the market is a very complex object. There are lots of players that might react in a different way. So, this might work, but it's a little risky. And the second, and I think is maybe perhaps more robust and simpler approach is for the Fed to go around and reveal its belief to the market, right? Because if you do that and you're able to communicate more fully both dimensions of your view or all dimensions of your view to the market, then you don't need to worry about these tantrums because the market will know your belief, and the market's reaction is not going to be that important. It's important because they will react in the right way. They will know your belief, right? They don't need to interpret your belief. They already know it. And in our little model, it turns out that with two dimensions of the disagreement, instead of just the current interest rate, if you also announce the future expected interest rate, you're able to basically communicate both dimensions of your belief, right? So we find a role for the dot curve, right? The future dots reveal the Fed's long-term view of activity, and the current dot then reveals the short-term view of activity. So current interest rate decision reveals the short-term view of economic activity. So together they reveal all dimensions of the Fed's belief. Of course, that's too simplistic. In reality, beliefs are much more complex. But the point is that communicating more with the public and revealing your belief more fully will help you do a better job of monetary policy and hit your gaps more frequently. And the reason is importantly not to persuade the market, right? So the reason to go around and make these announcements here in this model is not the market is opinionated, and their view of the economy doesn't change at all when they hear the Fed's view. But the reason is to communicate your view to the market, right? So that they don't misinterpret your view, because once the market knows your belief, you can actually devise, even when they disagree with you, you can devise appropriate policies, right? So agreement is difficult to attain. It's difficult to, it's actually very introspective, very intuitive, right? It's difficult to convince other people of your view, but we can at least agree to disagree. We can understand exactly how we disagree, because it turns out that in the monetary policy context, if you achieve that, you'll do a better job of monetary policy, right? So I think I'm running out of time, so let me wrap up. Motivated by the observation that the Fed and the financial markets disagree about the path of interest rates, we build a model in which these disagreements stem from differing views of economic activity, and particular aggregate demand. And we find that these differences, together with learning, translate into disagreements about expected rates. And in this environment, the market perceives monetary policy mistakes that leads to a rich set of implications. The Fed needs to, central banks need to partially accommodate the market, but they don't surrender to the market. This is very important. They just expect to implement their view more fully in the future, as they expect the market to learn from data and come closer to their view. But the partial accommodation is important to hit your target. And it turns out the revelation of the central bank's view to the public becomes a micro-founded monetary policy shock, and tantrum shocks in particular, which is a particular shock in which the market misreads the Fed's view and the forward curve overreacts, is particularly damaging, and that induces the Fed to act more gradually, and also motivates Fed communication, central bank communication policies designed to avoid tantrums. And I didn't have time to show you, but in the paper we have some results about inflation and cost push shocks as well, in case you want to take a look. But let me stop here and take questions if there are. Thank you for your attention.
ALP, this is Eli Remolona.
Hi, Eli.
I think it's a wonderful paper.
Thank you.
I find that it captures very important aspects of reality, and therefore it's a very useful paper, especially with regard to communication by the Fed. I do agree that it's not really about persuasion, but about avoiding misinterpretation. I have 3 comments, short comments. First of all, the idea of opinionated markets is very, very appealing, because we usually think of markets as having dispersed opinions or dispersed views. But many times I think it's useful to think of markets as coalescing around a certain view. And this reminds me actually of the Keynesian beauty contest, especially the model by Morris and Shin, which provides a mechanism for the markets to become opinionated. I think that might be worth citing. That paper might be worth citing. Second, you focus on disagreements about fundamentals, and of course there can be disagreements about the reaction function itself, and reaction functions are actually quite complex. They don't look very much like the Taylor rule. There's asymmetry in it, there's reversal aversion in it, and these things change over time. But I think it's still useful to think about disagreements about fundamentals. The Fed actually, I worked at the Fed for something like 15 years, and I covered financial markets for the Fed. The Fed takes very seriously the opinions of the markets. I should say the New York Fed does a survey of primary dealers. In fact, the New York Fed talks to primary dealers with very intense interviews every week, just to understand what the views really are. So there's a lot of respect. It's not just about the transmission mechanism. The Fed seriously approaches markets with humility. They want to know, why do you think differently? Is there something we're missing about your views? But occasionally also, and this is my third point, there are situations in the Fed in which the Fed disagrees with the market very dramatically and thinks it is right and thinks that the market is wrong. And this tends not to lead to gradualism, because your model leads to gradualism, the Brainerd type of gradualism. This leads to a deliberate surprise by the Fed. I can think of many occasions for this, but one is March 2009. This is the beginning of quantitative easing. And the market thought the central banks had run out of ammunition for quantitative easing, for influencing interest rates. So Bernanke engineered this massive surprise in the FOMC meeting of 2009, and that caused the whole yield curve to flatten very dramatically, which was the intended effect. As you can imagine, the Fed didn't know exactly what the effect was, but qualitatively, that was it achieved the intended effect. And this led to a kind of policy of surprises by Mario Draghi at the ECB, by Kuroda at the Bank of Japan. There was a couple of years of central banks intentionally trying to surprise the markets as a matter of trying to convince the markets that they were wrong. So that, I think, that aspect of monetary policy may be somewhat missing from the discussion. But a wonderful paper, ALP. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli, for these very thoughtful comments, and I agree with all of them, and we should think hard about incorporating. On the first point, I'd say the disagreements among the market are actually, I think, also important, and we think of maybe exploring that angle in future work. And I worked with that type of model before, and what happens is that what the markets, there is a weighted average view that aggregates the different views of the market participants, and there is still such a thing as a market's view, but it's a much more complex object. And as you said, it might also depend on Morris and Shin B2 contest type forces, so we should definitely look into that. And disagreement about the reaction function, yeah, we agree entirely. I think that's actually an interesting thing to explore as well. We've sort of zoomed in on the disagreement about inputs into the function, but here in this model, everyone knows the reaction function. So I think the first step is to communicate the reaction function. But what our model shows that even after you are able to fully communicate that, there might be residual disagreement, because people might still disagree about the inputs into that. And on the last point, that's very interesting. That so in the one way of thinking about our paper is that you're trying to shock the market in an optimal way. And for most of our analysis, it means you don't shock the market very much, because you're trying to engineer a particular change in the forward curve. So that's why, like, you move a little more cautiously. But in the episodes that you mentioned, because the interest rates were too high to begin with, like you were against zero lower bound, I think you were I agree with you that they were trying to basically shock the market in a different way and try to flatten, lower the interest rates. And it sort of fits with the spirit of you're trying to shock the market in a way to achieve your objective. It's just in that period, I think, because of zero lower bound, you really wanted to deliberately create a big accommodation shock. And But I take your point, and maybe we should discuss those episodes a bit. But these were wonderful and very thoughtful comments. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
As always, great and very thoughtful comments from Ali. Everyone should have Ali discussing his or her paper. Alp, may I convey a few questions from the audience, please?
Yes.
But before conveying them, may I sort of bring some information about the reaction function from my time in central banks and from the central bank in New Zealand, and also my friends at the Riksbank in Sweden tells me the same thing. There are times when the output and inflation forecasts with the private sector are identical, but yet we can still have significant divergences on interest rate path. That is something we observed in New Zealand time and time, and my friends at the Riksbank say the same thing, told me the same thing a few times. Here are some questions, Alp. How about if I read 4 or 5 of them and you try to answer them all in one go, Alp, because we are running out of time.
Okay.
Okay. The first one, I believe this one has already been answered, but are disagreements about the state of the economy, the strategy of the policymaker, or about the model of the economy? I guess that's been answered. Second one, how does heterogeneity of beliefs, both of the Fed and the market, influence the equilibrium, if at all? The third question is, if the disagreement of the markets and the central bank would be different in normal times versus in sort of distressed times like taper tantrum kind of environment. Then another question is similar to taper tantrum, given this average inflation targeting, given the Fed is kind of promising to be slow or not responding as much to inflation, is this model applicable to an environment the Fed is unlikely to respond to some shocks and differ from the markets? Finally,
sorry, Ozar, can you say that again? I didn't fully understand, hear that. Sorry, the last thing. Last question.
It's one question. The person is saying with the average inflation targeting, the Fed is telling us that they will not be responding to the inflation outcomes until inflation averages. The taper tantrum was about Fed saying something it would do, whereas in this case we know Fed will not be doing something while inflation is still going up. You know, if they start diverging too much from the markets, would your model still have the similar predictions that it had in the taper tantrum? The final comment is about the behavioral economics that you already mentioned. You know, there are the growth in behavioral kind of elements. Someone was asking, how similar is this to that kind of view, the Bayesian learning? Are they related?
Okay, these are great questions, and thanks to all the participants for the questions. And let me try to group the questions. So, Özer, your question I think is very important. So, if you look at the expectations about inflation or output, do you get a correct? It's related, I think, to these questions on heterogeneous beliefs, and also related to Ali's comment on the market being very dispersed view. So my co-author Ricardo always tells me that actually the surveys are not very informative, because what matters is the market. The fixed income, the bond market traders are ultimately a lot more important. And then you don't see their beliefs on output. Maybe you see their beliefs on inflation and inflation break-evens. That's something actually that would be worth looking. But I would be cautious to look at surveys to interpret what the market thinks, because the market is a different group of people, and the market itself is very heterogeneous. And so there's a dominant market view, which, and this relates to the question of heterogeneous beliefs, that depends in the models, at least that depends on the wealth weighted average of the different views. So whoever has more money to bet ends up having a more weight, and their view becomes more dominant. And how does that change the analysis? I think there's some interesting effects here that we haven't explored. because when the Fed changes, let's say when you surprise the market, you're also changing the people who are closer to your view end up winning, right? Their wealth was kind of going to grow a little bit, so they're going to become more dominant. And so that will affect, I think, the market view will change because it's a weighted average, and that weight depends on whoever gets it more right. So I think there's some interesting economics to explore. We haven't fully nailed that question, but I think it's certainly a very important angle, because in practice, as Eli already mentioned, there's a lot of dispersion, and there seems to be a lot of trading around these like information events like monetary policy announcements. So the other question was about how disagreements might be different in normal times versus distress times. And again, I think of this as related to this heterogeneity view maybe. So when you trigger like an event, I think our model captures maybe the first steps of what might happen in a tantrum type episode, that the long-term interest rates lift up more than what you intended. But then once that happens, you're going to trigger certain amplification mechanisms, because let's say the agents who are exposed to that rate hike are going to get hit, and their wealth will decline, and that might reduce risk tolerance in the markets, and they might that might create further increase in risk premium, maybe term premium adjust. So I think again, adding further heterogeneity and richness certainly into this framework is interesting. I don't think we capture everything that happens in taper tantrum type episodes. I think there is certainly additional amplification mechanisms that operate. And the other question was about average inflation targeting, and that's very interesting. So the Fed the recent disagreement, and this goes back to the question of disagreement about framework versus the state of the economy. So I think given that the Fed has switched frameworks recently, I think there is in fact, reason to think there might be genuine disagreements also about the framework, right? So do people really understand, if the market really understand inflation, average inflation targeting, and what is the inflation at which the Fed will start hiking? So I think so that this sort of goes beyond our model a little bit, but I think it sort of creates even more scope for disagreement. And relation to taper tantrum, given that the Fed shifted to accommodate more inflation, that should sort of help mitigate tantrums all else equal. But tantrum type thing could still happen if the market doesn't buy into the Fed's average inflation targeting framework, thinks they will start tapering, even despite what they say, they will start tapering after 2% or shortly after inflation is 2%, and the market is more bullish about economic activity than the Fed, then you could still have a taper-like situation similar to our model. But I think actually there is a scope for even more disagreement in the current environment than in our model because of this framework. And finally, very important question on how to think of these behavioral biases in this framework. So I've given you mostly a Bayesian interpretation of the model, where new things happen and people start with different views, and then they are Bayesian learners. But I think you could also write down models where maybe people have different learning models. So they look at the same macroeconomic data, but they put different weights on different things. Maybe the Fed puts more weight on Michigan survey and the market puts more weight on BLS employment report, or, you can think about that type of, and that in that type of world, the news releases themselves would generate or regenerate disagreements, and that you don't need new things to happen for disagreements to show up in that model. And I think some of that happens in practice as well. And we conjecture that most of what I've told you will apply in that type of environment as well. Because once a disagreement forms, and if you think about the mechanisms that I showed you, they will mostly still apply as long as each agent thinks he's right, he or she is right, and the other will on average come to its view. But it's certainly something worth exploring further, because I think there's an empirical literature that does suggest that in fact the Fed and the market have different learning models and put different weights on different pieces of data. So there is some truth to that idea, I think. But these are great questions and very thoughtful, and I really appreciate your attention and your comments. Thank you.
No, we thank you, ALP. Before closing, may I say one thing? Look, in our seminar series, we had, yes, chief economists, lots of brilliant economists, but we never had a governor, central bank governor, joining us. For the first time, we have a governor, and we really appreciate her attendance today. Much, much appreciated. ALP, that happens to be your seminar. And thank you very much, ALP. Much appreciated. Eli, would you like to close?
Thank you, Alp. I learned a lot from today's this discussion. So thank you very much. We hope to hear from you again in the future.
Thank you, Eli, and thanks everyone for coming and for your thoughtful remarks. It was great to join you. And I look forward to joining in the future as well.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe.
Stay safe, everyone.